Now, I'm going to need your help to get started this morning. Some of you are repeat customers. This is our third service of the day, and I recognize some of you. For whatever reason, you've chosen to participate again. So let these other folks jump in first. If they don't, jump in, though. This is critically important, what's about to happen. I'm going to vocalize an iconic movie theme, and I need you to guess it. If you can't guess it, it's going to be very difficult to get into this opening illustration and get the sermon going. So if you would, please. It's a team effort. Just shout it out when you know the answer. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. You got it. You got it. So, somebody at the last service said the Gator fight song. I was like, let's go. That iconic score was written by composer John Williams, who wrote themes for Star Wars, for Indiana Jones, and many other well-known movies. I almost asked Dr. Masters if he and the brass could carry it for us this morning and do a little bit of the theme, but we live stream, and I was worried about copyright infringement suits, and so I decided I'd just do it. Jaws is considered one of the all-time great suspense thrillers, but its success in provoking those edge-of-the-seat, spine-tingling moments is largely credited to a significant miscalculation by Steven Spielberg and his effects crew that led to the colossal failure of their mechanical shark. You see, they had not anticipated, as we would have as South Floridians, just how inhospitable saltwater would be to the animatronic shark. To hear director Steven Spielberg tell the story, he shares the shark didn't really work all the time. In fact, the shark didn't work hardly at all. And so these filmmakers, they were pressed into the unenviable position of having to figure out, how do you film a movie about a deadly shark bent on devouring swimmers and seagoers without the shark? Spielberg and his crew were compelled to make what turned out to be this momentous artistic choice not to show the shark. And it turned out that in not showing the shark in the lion's share of the movie, but rather showing the shark's perspective, or representing the shark's presence, you may remember, by showing objects that it dragged through the water, be it a swimmer in the opening scene or those barrels attached to the shark by harpoon. It turned out to be a brilliant accident. Because in doing so, the viewer, you and me, that we were left to imagine, to immerse ourselves into the world of Jaws, to create our own understanding of the deadly shark. And in doing this, transference happens, right? Then when we go into the real world, when I am swimming in the ocean, if I allow my mind to go there, I can picture the shark's point of view underneath me. Perhaps you've had that experience. In some way, we continue the story of the shark when we leave. Well, this morning, I'd like for you to consider that Spielberg and his team may have unintentionally borrowed from the artistic storytelling technique of the writer of Mark's gospel. Let me show you. I want to invite you to open up the Bibles that you've brought with you from home, your pew Bibles, or on your mobile devices, and turn to Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. This morning, I want to direct your attention to the way that Mark ends his gospel. And so we're going to read these last 8 verses of Mark. Verses 1 through 8. Now, if you're looking at a Bible, you may be sitting there saying, but Nick, I'm looking at the Bible, and this isn't the end. There are verses 9 through 20. Well, I'm going to ask you to do a second thing this morning, and is to take my word for it that verses 1 through 8 are the end. Most biblical scholars generally agree that this is, in fact, the end of Mark's gospel, that verses 9 through 20 were added much later by someone else. In fact, your Bibles likely say something to that effect. Now, if you have more questions, if you'd like to dig deeper into that and why we believe verses 1 through 8 are the real end, I'll buy the coffee. We'll sit down and we can talk it out. But I do not have time to lay out that case this morning, so concede that point for me. So if this is true, then Mark's gospel, in its original intended form, ends right here in verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, they bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you." And so they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Did you notice anything Jaws-esque? Who's missing in this concluding scene of Mark's gospel? Jesus. The resurrected Jesus is nowhere to be found in this closing scene of Mark's gospel. The writer leaves Jesus out of it. This is it. And making it even more curious, the women at the tomb, they go away and say nothing. They say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, I do want to clear one thing up. This is not a chauvinistic reading, to be sure. You know, the men in the story are still hiding somewhere, nowhere to be found. But Mark ends the story with an empty tomb and with no resurrected Jesus. And the very first to receive the gospel news they're afraid. Mark's gospel, in addition to ending in this curious way, is also haltingly human and honest. These women, in the wake of Jesus' death, they do what so many of us do when faced with loss, with grief. They cling to ritual and routine, what they know. These close followers, they've been following Jesus for 1, 2, 3 years. They saw themselves as a part of this movement, this thing that was happening. And then Jesus is just dead. The previous day, they've been sitting around all Saturday on the Sabbath, just sitting in their grief. And so finally, as the sun goes down, they do what people do. They got up and they did something. They went out and they got spices to clean the body. You know, what do we do now that our leader is dead, now that Jesus is dead? Well, we do what we do when anyone dies, they thought to themselves. We'll clean the body. You see, this was not something that was especially done for Jesus, but rather the custom. How do you cling to ritual and routine in times of grief? In what ways do you find refuge in routine when you don't know what else to do. To be sure, these women, they don't know what's coming. They simply seeking to do the next right thing, to clean the body. As they approach the tomb, their biggest concern is, well, that's an awfully big rock. But friends, let us not be so quick to dismiss the fear these women experience. In fact, I believe their initial silence, their fear, I think is instructive for us this morning. As we come to believe, for perhaps some amount of fear is called for. Because Jesus, as we become believers, calls us to some pretty radical ways of being, right? For example, as believers, we're called to love our enemies. To love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us. I'm reminded that a second election cycle is coming. We are called, friends, to pray for one another, to love our enemies. I read this week that Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, maybe you've been following this story, has now spent more than a year in a Russian prison charged with espionage. In this particular article that I read, Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, who you may remember was held for 544 days in an Iranian prison under similarly false pretenses. He was interviewed in this article, and he said he remembers the day when he was in that Iranian prison and crossed the 1-year threshold. He called it the worst milestone imaginable. I bring that up because Jesus calls Evan to pray for his Russian captors. Jesus calls Evan's parents to pray for his Russian captors. That's the kind of radical love that we're called to. So maybe some amount of fear as we begin to believe is appropriate. Fear has a place as we come to believe and understand what it is that we are called into in this Christian faith. In fact, as we come to believe, we come to understand that is just the beginning of learning how we're called to live as Christ followers. It's why Easter wasn't the end, but rather the beginning of this. It's why we walk with one another to understand how it is that Jesus is calling us to live in these new and radical ways. Now, to be sure, belief in the gospel does mean that we are freed from the baggage of our old lives. That stuff that has been weighing you down, the shame that we carry around. Belief in the gospel means that we are freed to live into these new and radical ways of being. But belief in the gospel is just the beginning. If you look at Mark's gospel, the way it begins, and maybe you'll remember this. Many believe this not to be the opening line, Mark 1:1, but rather the title of the entire work. He writes the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. He begins it that way, and then the gospel writer ends his work by leaving it up to the reader to decide what we will do with the news. Verse 8 is never intended to be the final word. It's a work that's only completed by us, by the reader, by you and me. This gospel is only the beginning. It is only completed in and through you and me and through us as we carry out the next part of the story. What we celebrate today is not that Mark's gospel ends, but that our story begins upon these women entering the empty tomb. And whatever we do with that fact, whether or not you choose to believe it or to share it or to be afraid or to whatever, what we do know is that upon entering the tomb, Jesus was not there because he'd been raised. The tomb was empty. The tomb is empty, and the tomb will be forever empty because death was not the end. And death is not the end. And the question that we are left with today as we leave is, how will each of us end the story? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, friends, Christ is risen.